I mean, faith is important, hope is important, generosity is important, nonviolence is important. All these other things are not unimportant or even separate.
Yeah.
But somehow love, I think, is the sense of the total encompassing self-giving that opens into the infinity of the other. That what doesn't run out in 5 years or 55 years, it just keeps going. And that's sort of, life and love are inseparable in a certain sense.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Free Radical Podcast. Today, I had the great honor of sitting with a revered scholar, priest, and author, Francis Clooney. Francis X. Clooney is a Jesuit priest and Parkman Professor of Divinity at Harvard Divinity School, where he has taught since 2005 after 2 decades at Boston College. A pioneer in comparative theology, he explores interreligious learning through deep engagement with Hindu and Christian classics, especially theological texts in Sanskrit and Tamil. He has authored numerous influential books, including Comparative Theology, Deep Learning Across Religious Borders, and His Hiding Place is Darkness. He has recently published his memoir, Hindu and Catholic, Priest and Scholar, a Love Story, around which our conversation will take place. So it has been a very enriching exchange with Professor Clooney, again, revolving around this beautiful love story that he has had in terms of his formation as a Jesuit priest, scholar, intellectual, his love for Hinduism, Ramanuja, other traditions, how to navigate academia with passionate, deep faith, how to navigate life itself with choices, regret, uh, different avenues of possibilities, different calls, different inspirations, which are his sides of contemporary academia, contemporary Hindu, Gaudiya Vaishnav tradition, his life as a celibate priest, and all that it entails, teaching, preaching, studying, lectio divina, again, comparative theology, spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, traditionalism, perennialism, interspirituality, poetry, ever evolving spirituality, the evolution of the divine, and so on and so forth. It has been really an honor for me to have him in our conversation. So, this is the Free Radical Podcast. And to support it, please subscribe to our channel by clicking on the bell. And if you feel inspired and nourished by this conversation, you can pay back by paying forward. Like it, share it, drop your thoughts to keep this conversation for what it is, an ongoing, alive, vibrant, ever-evolving dialogue and exchange of ideas between ourselves and with reality itself. So, dear brothers and sisters, without further ado, here is Professor Francis Clooney. Father Francis Clooney, thank you so much for joining us in the Free Radical Podcast. Welcome.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
My pleasure. And I'll be addressing you as Frank, since you kindly agreed to be invited into joining into our conversation in a more intimate setting, despite you could be addressing so many other dignified credentials. So thanks so much for allowing that. And as I like to introduce my guest to my audience, in this case, I got the fortune of meeting Frank through a common friend and scholar, Jeffrey Long, and Frank worked with Harvard and particularly the Hindu monastic program. And then with other monks, if I'm not mistaken, Swami Padmanabha, he was part of the Harvard monastic program there. We did a podcast together relatively soon. So again, my pleasure to be here with you today. And our conversation, today's episode will center about Frank's recent book, Hindu and Catholic, Priest and Scholar, Love Story. You can see the book right behind Frank's back. So all of you recommended to read it for sure. So I'd like to begin asking you, it's a memoir. So why did you choose to write a memoir at this stage? Recently, I was studying some of the traditionalists like René Guénon and Fritz Schwann and others, and they are quite fond of criticizing actually biographies, which it's not my cup of tea personally, but they will say that it's kind of antithetical to humility, since humility is a state of emptiness in which our thoughts and actions appear as strangers to us, things like that. So I'm curious about what's your view in as a priest, as a scholar, as someone who is a spiritual practitioner, from which place you have been called to writing a personal narrative.
A very interesting question. I think in part it was done for the reason of reaching a certain age, later in my career, certainly not earlier, of trying for my own sake even to look back and say, well, what does this all add up to? So I've been teaching over 40 years now at the university level. I've been a Catholic priest for almost 50 years. And these things accumulate, and you want to make sense of your life. And I think the exercise of telling the story needn't be egoistical or self-centered in the bad sense, but rather, I think for people of faith, the grace of God working out when you're young, when you're middle-aged, when you're older, the ups and downs of life, and finding where these pieces come together. I'm also part of the Roman Catholic tradition. So back to the time of St. Augustine, who wrote the Confessions, one of the first autobiographies in the West, exploring his life in God's presence. And I think if you look at your life in God's presence, and if you look at your life with a sense of without God's presence, this would have been a great mess. This would have failed. But rather God leading the way, and then testifying, saying, well, God is good in the world, God creates nature, God does bountiful good things for people. Our lives too can be witnesses to what God can do if we try our best to let God work within us. I should add one other point. People are interested in the field. The general field I work in is both Hindu Christian studies, but also comparative theology. Faith-seeking understanding across religious borders. And sort of saying, where did that come from? And trying to tell the personal story of where my discipline came from.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. And I really resonate with your description of writing a memoir as a bearing witness of God's grace and presence throughout every chapter of your life. And a reframing of a memoir not as a self-centered or narcissistic attempt, but actually something that can promote real humility if you go through your life chapters with that awareness of God's grace, and how without it, as you say, our life will be a mess. So thank you for that clarification. I will say that part of your book, at least, it reminds me of, and I'm sure you're familiar with Cluster Meyer's work, and especially his work, Hindu and Christian in Vrindavan, a small book.
Yes.
Very beautiful work that I hold dear. So I'm so thankful that by going through your own memoir, somehow I was taken back to traveling to India and to his experiences as a Christian there. So beautiful.
And I think when Professor Klostermaier was a great scholar and wrote so many books. But if you want to see, where is the key? You go back and say, well, in the beginning, when he was there in Vrindavan, when he had his early experiences, so much came from those initial moments. And while the scholarly works are not replaced by an autobiography, you can see them in a different light coming from within, and not simply meeting obligations in the academic world or something like that.
Thank you for that. So Frank, you describe a defining encounter with God as a teenager, if I'm not mistaken. You say something like a moment. I like how you said it. It was, I don't know if a book or in your book or in a lecture you gave about your book, because I went through both. And you say that it was a moment that is enough for a lifetime. I really appreciated that way of putting it. What was the content of that meeting? So, and somehow that defining encounter framed your entire life journey trajectory. So you even relate that to Kuhn's notion of paradigm shift, before and after that moment. So I don't know if you will be open to share more about that moment and how it continues to shape you. And I'm asking if you will be willing, because at least in my Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, we have this ethic that some of these experiences, you are invited not to share them if they are too personal and private. So I'm inviting you to say yes or no, and that's totally fine, either of both.
I mean, if you had asked me 2 years ago, before the book came out, I might have said, oh, it's too private, whatever. But since I published it in a book and
now
put
it's
it
out in the world. So.
it's hardly secret at this point. But again, it's sort of related to, your previous question, a good question about where where is the kind of the spiritual beginning of our lives within our spiritual lives? Because we're often born, certainly I was born in a Roman Catholic tradition,
Mm.
grew up in a religious household. We went to church, we had the Mass and the sacraments. I served at the altar as an altar boy. I went to Catholic grammar school, Catholic high school, all of which was wonderful. And I think I'm endlessly indebted to that. But at a certain point, I know that for some people, it never really seems to get beyond that. They have a sense of a Catholic culture or a
Hmm.
Vaishnava culture or a Muslim
Yeah.
culture, whatever. And it's sort of that's it, and they may be happy with it, but it doesn't turn on personally. And I
Hmm.
was looking back over my life and say, well, how did it work out that I would choose at age 16, 17 to want to become a priest? Went to the seminary at 18.
Mm.
How did I choose to study as I studied? Why did I go to Kathmandu, Nepal to teach school there? Why have I done all the things I do? And why is it, 50, well more than 50 years later, I'm still doing these things.
Mm.
One begins to slow down as you get older, certainly, but there's some kind of a inner push, inner energy that I think keeps us going even as we get older. And for me, I trace it back to that moment. An ordinary night in the summer, July of 1966. I was
Okay.
15 years old. A sense of the immediacy of God's presence kind of rushing upon me, and
Mm.
a sense of not hearing a voice or seeing a vision, but being touched by God.
Mm.
And in a sense, I think in that kind of moment, the touch or the insight or the voice, there's a sense where time and eternity meet. And there's a sense that, we are creatures of time. We live a certain amount of time on the earth, and then we are no more in this current body. But God is forever past, present, and future. God is, everything before, in the middle, and after. And when that moment of God's touch meets our lives, then in a sense it's saying, well, the smallness of your life, the 70, 80, 90 years, whatever, touched by the eternity of God and God's comprehensive love and mercy is more than enough for one lifetime. I
Hmm.
also know of figures who tell similar stories. And you mentioned Thomas Kuhn. So his famous book, the Paradigms of Scientific Revolutions, that book, and also personal accounts about how one boring day he was trying to understand Aristotle's science and couldn't get it. And then he looked out the window and suddenly he got it. And he
Mm.
suddenly realized he had gone through a paradigm shift. And suddenly now there was a whole way of looking at life. We moved from one way of looking at the world to another.
Mm.
Or the founder of my religious order, the Jesuits, Society of Jesus, St. Ignatius Loyola, when he was a young man and on his spiritual journey, he went through many ups and downs. He was wounded in battle. He had a conversion experience. He lived in a cave and meditated for some time. But he said one day he was sitting by the river, the Cardona River, and suddenly had this sense of the infinity of God. And that moment sitting by the river was enough for his life, that he learned more in that moment than he could possibly learn in the rest of his life. And
Mm.
that resonated with me when I read that, years after my original experience. Oh, like that one touch of God is enough for a lifetime. You don't need, you're blessed if God's, visits you many times, but even one
Yeah.
moment of God is more than enough.
Yeah. Thank you. I, of course, not wanting to compare cases here, but you've brought some others apart from yours to the table. I cannot avoid thinking about my own experiences, and I totally agree. I can still recall some of those unique, extraordinary moments, and you continue to ruminate on them for a whole lifetime, and still is too
Yeah.
much. And I appreciate how many of the examples you highlighted, many of them had those paradigm shifts in moments, that very unexpected moments, not the usual moments that you will think, okay, I'm in the midst of mass or in the midst of a kirtan on this holy place, but probably in a so-called ordinary moment, and that you have the epiphany at right away, right? I recall
Yeah.
Thomas
And
Merton saying, I think your salvation begins in the most ordinary moments of your daily life. So
Yeah, I mean, one beautiful passage he writes, when he's a monk in Kentucky in Louisville, he goes to the dentist in Kentucky in
yeah.
Louisville. He's talking about he's waiting out on the street corner for his ride to pick him up.
Yeah.
And suddenly watching the people walking past this monastic person, he's in the town, he's not talking to anyone,
Yeah.
but suddenly he realizes he's connected to everyone and everything.
Yeah.
And if you go to Louisville, on that street corner, there's even a plaque there saying Thomas Merton had a moment here where he connected to everyone and everything. And part of the point seems to be that it doesn't have to be, you can't produce this, you can't plan it.
Yeah.
Getting a very holy setting, which are very important, of course, but nonetheless, God can surprise us when we're not expecting it. And that has a greater power even.
Yeah, I'm thinking probably we need to create those holy settings, so to say, and holy spaces for prayer and practice. So then we are willing and able to receive God's grace if whenever it wants to come on a corner of an unexpected street, like you're mentioning.
Yeah.
Thank you. So also you speak in your work about the double formation, right? And that comes in the title of your memoir, Hindu and Catholic, priest and scholar. So it seems to me that much of your work and life lives in the tension, so to say, between fidelity to your tradition, openness to another, for example. And I'm thinking, what does it take emotionally and spiritually to remain long-term in that liminal space? And of course, to grow in it, because you cannot just remain in the same place, but grow in that, inhabiting that arena, so to say, liminal space.
Yeah, and so I do, and thank you for mentioning it, picking up on this notion of a double formation. Partly because I think in any of our traditions, I'm sure the traditions of your listeners as well, we are formed in our early lives. And it could be simply in our household, it could be by genetics, our body, but our family, the schools we go to. But for me, it became, intense when it was not only my Catholic upbringing, being taught by the nuns, being taught by the priest in high school, but entering a religious order, the Jesuits, which is an order which has the vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, but it's not monastic. You're meant to be in the world, in the city. We were emphasized over and over again, you have to make this a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional way of life, where every part of you is produced or formed according to the gift that God has given you. In this case, in the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, that you have to read the scriptures with a certain empathy. You have to go from reading the scripture to going to the church services, the mass, and so on. You have to then practice it in love of your neighbors, love and community. All these things are connected. And with an emphasis, my order is a very intellectual order, that you can't read the scriptures, you can't read the fathers and mothers of the church, the early church, or the great theologians, or even the poets, Dante, for instance, Divine Comedy, unless you kind of throw yourself into it and are taken up in it with your imagination and your heart. All of this is bonding, important. So when it came, I entered the Jesuit order in 1968. When I started experiencing Hinduism, Buddhism in Kathmandu in 1973, 5 years later, when I was sent there to teach in the school, I realized little by little that if I was really going to personally gain from this experience of Buddhist tradition, but mainly Hindu tradition, that it really had to do with a kind of a formation-like experience. Because if I simply immerse myself in my tradition, heart and soul, mind and body completely, and then the other tradition, it was just like a book you pick off the shelf. You intellectually look at it and you think about it and you write something logical, but you keep your distance from it. Well, that almost, guarantees from the start that it's not going to work very deeply. Deeply immersed in my tradition, and of another tradition, I have the most superficial approach. No, it had to be like it. It can't be the same. I don't really believe you can be a member of 2 traditions at once. But you can, as you were suggesting, and as I suggest, sort of on the borderline, on the margin between 2. And I think that becomes, in a sense, So after first formation in your own tradition, after empathizing with and trying to go deep into another, then you have kind of a third formation, which I don't think I talk about in the book, but rather you're on the edge. You want to keep the commitments of your youth, of your vocation, our vows, and you want to also appreciate and keep changing and growing in relationship to the other tradition. And for that, you have to be, 100% of your own tradition, deeply engaged in the other tradition, and somehow on the edge between the two, without it being kind of selling them out or cutting them short. And that requires, balance. And I talk in the subtitle of the book, a love story. And I think because I've enjoyed greatly the work I've done, and enjoyed greatly learning from Hindu traditions, going to temples, traveling in India, and then reading the texts that I read and so on. I mean, love, you cannot take love for granted, and a married couple can't take love for granted, or parents and children can't take it for granted. So too in the spiritual life, we have to kind of keep working at it, being honest, noticing when things are going dry, noticing things when coming to life again, and saying, I will keep trying to keep this vision, this experience back and forth between the two alive, as I did in my youth, in middle age, and in old age.
Thank you for sharing that. I was thinking about some words of one of my mentors in the Christian tradition we were talking about before the recording, Father Richard Rohr, and he will say that where he inhabits his own tradition, so he can be open to other insects and engage in proper, what I like to call theological cross-pollination, he chooses to live on the edge of the inside, right? So he's an insider to his Franciscan order. He's not leaving the order, but he's close enough to the edge so he can see what's beyond the borders of his tradition. And he's not like too much of an insider, so he cannot get any feedback from anywhere else, but he's not a cynic outsider throwing stones into the inside, so to say. So I appreciate always that expression.
I think I use in things I've said. I'm not sure if I forget if it's in the book or not, but I mean the outer edge, like culturally, socially, where two traditions meet each other, even two cultures, two parts of the world meet each other. You can travel. You can literally travel back and forth. You can get on a plane and travel. You can go from a church to a temple. All these things can be done carefully. But there's also the inner edge. What does my tradition mean to me in my heart or in my soul? And that's where I think the traditions also meet. And if there's a sense of a living, vital back and forth on the inner edge between who I am and what I'm called to, that can be reinforced and made honest by all the other encounters outside in community and society, travel, and so on like that. So it's a dynamic, which I think everybody has in their lives anyway. Who am I in myself and who am I in relationship to you? They're not unrelated realities, but they go together.
Thank you. Thank you for that further layer to the conversation. So you mentioned a few minutes ago, apart from the title of your book, the subtitle is somehow a love story. So I must say it's my favorite part of the whole title. I really like the concept of love story, or in our tradition, we have this notion in Sanskrit, abhisar, which is like love journey. Like for example, when Krishna plays the flute and the gopis run behind the sound of the flute, they engage in an abhisar, in a love journey. So somehow I'm relating to that. And I like to ask you what I like to ask many people, including myself, on a daily basis. How would you define love at this point in your life? Because as you know, in Sanskrit, there are so many words for love, in Greek, in Latin, but sometimes in English or other languages, we used to reduce the whole thing to one word. So it can be misleading in its own way. So how will you define love at this point in your life, especially?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, not an easy one.
Yeah, I know. Sorry for that.
In this conversation, I whip out a dictionary and tell you, here's what love means in the dictionary. You say there'll be 22 meanings probably.
Yeah, we should write the whole dictionary just defining the word love, probably.
There probably is one somewhere. I think, I mean, when I think of love, obviously there's going to be, the romantic part of it, the spontaneous part of it, this mutual attraction, let's say between two people, one for the other, or parents and children and so on like that. This kind of instinctive, intuitive bond that
Mm,
you have a sense we belong together. I will give myself for you. We will be in contact. I will stick my neck out for you. I'll help you. That kind of bond that doesn't necessarily make total rational sense, but it's
mhm,
saying like we belong together. But
mhm,
I think as one lives one life, one also realizes that love is active in what we give ourselves to and what we work at every day. And so the idea of a love not as a momentary emotion or a gift of the second, but also as a commitment to a way of life. Um,
mm,
Loving in service, loving in the details,
mm,
loving in the way we treat one another, um, loving in part through the joy, finding where is my bliss, where is the joy of my life,
mhm,
where what is it that keeps me alive and gets me up in the morning? Um, where is that? And in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, but Jesus is asked in the New Testament, what are the great commandments?
mhm,
And he says, well, the first great commandment is to love God with your entire heart, your mind, your soul, your body completely.
mhm,
And the second commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And
mm.
I don't think he necessarily means simply an emotional attachment, although that's very important, or even a joy, but that to which you give yourself without reservation, that which kind of captures your imagination, captures your heart, changes the way you act, both with your neighbor in this world, and you would say, I think, with all living beings in a way, but also with God who is in the world and greater than the world. Um, the last thing I would say, and you can push it further if you want, would be at the very end of my book,
Mhm,
and I mentioned, the subtitle is a love story, and I mentioned how it, for me, and I think for many of us, it's really not so much loving until one is loved. It is
mm.
not that I loved God first, but that God has loved me. So a
Yeah.
sense of overwhelming being cared for, being called by name, being chosen, being protected by God.
Mm,
And then human love is a response.
mhm,
I can't be the first one to love God. God loves me first, and then I love God back. Um, but I think we tend to use the word love. I mean, faith is important, hope is important, generosity is important, nonviolence is important. All these other things are not unimportant or even separate.
yeah.
But somehow love, I think, is the sense of the total encompassing self-giving that opens into the infinity of the other,
Mm,
that what doesn't run out in 5 years or 55 years, it just keeps going. And that's sort of, life and love are inseparable in a certain sense.
mm. Amen, Frank. Thanks so much for that. That
Thank you.
was a beautiful sermon unto itself. So I'm glad that I asked you the question about love. So since I was planning to ask you about the very closing of the book, but since you brought it now, let's go there for a minute. Because you end your book with a biblical quote from John's first letter, right? Like, we love because God first loved us.
Yes.
So I'm currently finishing my fourth book. Actually, in a few days from the day we're recording this, I'm about to publish my third book, which you know it because you have generously agreed to write an endorsement to it. So
Yes.
deep gratitude for that. But I'm already done with the fourth book, which will be on God's unconditional love and how important it is to gain awareness of the fact that we are loved by God, and on that foundation we can dare to love Him back for the right reasons, so to say. Because many times we may try to love God without feeling that He loves us already, so it may become a form of meritocracy, and I'm trying to earn God's love and perform or become perfect, and there's fear and intimidation and calculation. But if we start with the notion, as I like to call it, of irreversible grace, not irreversible damage, but irreversible grace, it's a grace given, and once given is not taken back. That can create such a wholesome and inspiring motivation for us to approach the divine, trying to return the embrace or return the gaze. So you referred to that a moment ago, God's initiating love. And in my opinion, of course, that's very present in Christian theology, but in my personal opinion, that's a little bit underexplored in Hinduism in general. So that's at least personally why I felt the need to write the book from my own Gaudiya Vaishnava perspective, trying to show that's actually there in the scriptures as well. It's not that we're against that, but somehow I have felt it a little bit unexplored, and of course with some consequences. So I don't know which are your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting question in itself, and interesting in terms of how different traditions talk about
Mm-hmm.
the priority of divine love.
Mm.
Uh, I think in some ways it makes sense, and you realize, like again in the Bible, but you can see parallels in bhakti poetry in India as well. In the beginning, God made me be. In the beginning, God called me by name. In the
Mm-hmm.
Catholic tradition and the biblical tradition, Jeremiah the prophet, before you were in the womb, before you existed at all, I called you and I named you. And
Mm.
this profound sense that life is a gift. And I think in a Hindu context or a Buddhist context, there may be a sense of, this short life is but part of a longer life story on both before and after. But it's all this kind of giving. But I think maybe in terms of what you're pointing to, in terms of how this is emphasized or not in, let's say, Vaishnava tradition, Sri
Mm-hmm.
Vaishnava, Gaudiya Vaishnava, there may be a sense that we in the Christian West, from the Bible and the New Testament, take for granted almost that if it's love, it's personal. And
Mm-hmm.
if it's personal, it's a matter of calling one another by name and having this trust relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And the stories, we see in the Gospels of Jesus, helping the beggar or helping the blind person or calling apostles on the beach are so driven into the Christian mind
Mm-hmm.
that that's love. Even if one can express love through policies, through decisions, through programming, love doesn't always have to be one-on-one. But I think there may be a way in which then you have to look for it, and I'm glad you're onto this and writing about this, the personal nature of love in Hindu tradition.
Mm.
I think as you know very well, the Bhagavad Gita, let's say, I mean, there's incredible teachings there about the self and detachment and karma yoga, and so on. But there seems to be this sense that Krishna says it a number of times, and Arjuna amazingly, like in chapters 11 and 12, responds, um, Krishna, I had no idea who you were. I had no idea what you were for me.
Mm.
Krishna says, you are Priya to me. You are Priya. You
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
beloved of me. And to you, I reveal this that I've not revealed to everybody.
Mm.
I think, that kind of beautiful theme, that what starts out as the teacher kind of instructing the student on the problems of life
Mm-hmm.
becomes a very personal relationship. And God is the teacher and we are the student. And it does become personal.
Yeah.
Um, I think, I'm more familiar with the Vaishnava poetry of the South, the Alvars, the
Mm-hmm.
Tamil saints. And so often in that poetry, there is a sense of, God who is great, God who is infinite, God who has done great deeds in the past. Suddenly, God is right here now, and
Mm.
God is in my life, and God is inside me. And that personal touch, I think, is always there, but it may be required to be more stressed and more brought out. Just
Mm.
as I would say to a Catholic, who comes to Mass every Sunday and hears the readings and hears the sermon and goes to communion, maybe goes to other sacraments, confession, and so on like that.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is related to you personally.
Yeah.
Jesus is in your life. Talk to him personally.
Mm.
It's always a further step. It doesn't mean you stop doing the others, but it is God knows each of us as persons and God speaks
Yeah.
to us as persons.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can assume I love the notion that you're mentioning about personalism. My second book I sent you, I remember, it's called Radical Personalism. So I'm
Yeah.
all for
Yeah.
personal relationship. And yeah, what I personally felt that needs some further emphasis, at least from my tradition, is the notion of sometimes we emphasize, okay, God loves his devotee, as you were quoting Krishna speaking to Arjuna, but sometimes we may make of it some kind of exclusivistic claim, like, okay, Krishna loves his devotees, but what about those who are not his devotees, right? And the notion of, again, God's unconditional love, or the notion as of the Bhagavad Purana will say that God is seeing everyone in potential, according to their brightest potential. So of course, in everyone's brightest potential, every soul is a devotee. So one could make that argument, and okay, God loves only his devotees, but everyone in potential is a devotee. So God is loving everyone, right? So
I mean, because it would be very inappropriate for us to put limits on God's love and say, well, God loves up to here,
yeah,
and then God's love stops there.
yeah,
Even when you read, let's say Bhagavad Gita chapter 9,
mm-hmm.
um, even people, even women, even low caste people, even people of uh, very humble ways of activity or employment,
Yeah,
can all come to me. And
yeah,
he says, whoever you worship, you're really worshiping me.
mm.
Tends to stop a little bit at the edges of India, and it means us. But if the logic of it would be, at least from a Christian viewpoint, is that it doesn't stop at the edges of India. It doesn't stop in the diaspora. Um, that ability, everyone can come to Krishna, is a universal teaching, and no one is left out. Or Ram in the Ramayana, when Vibhishana comes to him and takes refuge with him, the sense that whoever takes refuge with me, I will protect them.
Mm-hmm.
As you know very well, Vibhishana, people are warning, don't trust him. He's the brother of Ravana.
Mm-hmm.
Chase him out, kill him, whatever. And Rama says, though, if somebody comes to me and takes refuge with me,
Mm-hmm.
anyone, anywhere, anytime, I accept. And that doesn't have the bonds of saying only this group or only that
Yeah,
group, only
yeah,
people like us. No, it's universal.
yeah.
It doesn't mean that we're not loved in an individual particular way, but it
Mm-hmm.
does mean that we don't get to tell God who God can love.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we tried that so hard so many times, right? To put limits
That's right.
on the unlimited. As ridiculous as that sounds,
Yeah.
where we humans we have so many PhDs in that area.
Yes, too many.
So going back to your book, Frank, you mentioned how specific decisions in life, even small ones, reroute your journey profoundly. So how do you, now being, I think, 74, 75 years old, how do you look back on those choices today? Do you see those choices that created particular trajectories as the unfolding of divine providence? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think first of all, I'll say I'm a very young man. I'm only 74, not 75. So
Sorry for that, Frank.
I just have to wait a month and a half before I'd be 75. So
Okay, happy birthday in advance.
um, I think people say that we live our life forward, and we understand our life looking back.
Hmm.
It's a way in which, as you get older, and again, it's another reason for either writing a memoir or thinking a memoir, to
Hmm.
look at our lives and say, things I could not possibly have predicted 50, 60, 70 years ago, suddenly they worked out marvelously. Things sometimes go wrong and things are painful, and people do get lost. But nonetheless, looking back and saying these things came together. And I list some of them in the book. But even, passing the entrance examination, going to a Jesuit high school in New York City. If
Hmm.
I hadn't gone to a Jesuit school, maybe I wouldn't have entered the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order. After I took my vows as a young Jesuit, telling the superiors, I want to go far abroad for my teaching experience. And then I said, I want to go to India. And they could have said, no, we need you to teach in Manhattan or
Mm-hmm.
Buffalo or
Mm-hmm.
Syracuse, whatever. But they said, yes, go. And that opening experience in Kathmandu for 2 years was so important. Or when I was ordained a priest in 1978, most priests who go on for further study will do theology or philosophy or related field. My provincial superior even recommended I would go to Germany to study theology.
Hmm.
I told him what I really want to do is study Hinduism in depth.
Hmm.
And I ended up going to the University of Chicago to the South Asia department. But he could have said, no, that's not what Catholic priests do.
Yeah.
You can't do that. You can do that in the summer if you want, but you can't do
Hmm.
that. But he said yes.
Mm.
And then finally, just the third example, I taught for 21 years at Boston College, the Catholic Jesuit university up here. And then I got an offer to come over to Harvard, where I am now. And the provincial again could have said, no, you can't do that. You're a Jesuit, teaching the Jesuit school. But he
Mm.
said, sure, go ahead. And not that my life would have been ruined at any of these points if somebody had said no. But when I look back at my life and say, Jesuit, Kathmandu, Chicago, graduate studies, Boston College, Harvard, there's a kind of harmony to it that was not really of my doing, because I could have made a terrible mess of my life at any point.
Mm.
But when you look back and say, all of this, I've been very blessed, it's fit together. And even now, trying to use the gifts I have to serve God's people, to learn the truth, to see the beauty,
Mm.
all of that I do in the way I do it because of all these marvelous things that happened along the way. Whereas if somebody had said no, 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 my life would be very different.
Mm. Mm. Thank you. I'm kind of the boy, of course, going back to my own life story and making comparison notes. And yeah, it's totally true. And it's fascinating in its own way how certain things unfold in certain particular direction
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not in another, and how to say own your life and honor those particular doors that were open, and yeah, with commitment, responsibility, and gratitude. So in the context of those choices, of course, you mentioned also, of course, you are a priest, you're a scholar. In a recent lecture that I watched, you reflected on the price of being an intellectual. In your visit to India, you mentioned that you, if I'm not mistaken, you were able to at least visit the place of Mother Teresa, though you didn't have that much time for too much interaction, but you admired the life of radical service of people like her. Uh, at the same time, you became a professor. I think you mentioned surrounded by comfort, structure, prestige. That's how you frame it. And so I'm curious about how you, at the same time, you're a Jesuit with a vow of poverty. So I'm curious about how that looks like in the context of being a Harvard scholar, and how you navigate the tension between social service and a life of intellectual pursuits, which is a tension that I personally feel in this chapter of my journey in my own way as well. So just interested in hearing your thoughts.
Yeah. So, if I go back to the early 1970s, when I had
Mm.
this sense of um, wanting to expand my horizons to realize the larger world outside of the small world in which I grew up in,
Mm-hmm.
I eventually settled on India as the place I wanted to go without any real background or knowledge of India.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up going to Kathmandu because of visa reasons. But what attracted me, as I mentioned in the memoir, Mahatma Gandhi and Mother Teresa, and this sense of radical solidarity with people in trouble, fasting as Gandhi did, Mother Teresa leaving the comforts of the convent in Calcutta in order to go out and serve the poorest of the poor, that these were incredibly prophetic witnesses and intense love, where they didn't play it safe and simply do good, virtuous things on weekdays and take the weekend off.
Mm.
They they gave themselves completely. And I think, if I had another life, in part, it would be let's do that.
Mm.
Not that anyone can simply snap their finger and say, I'll be Mother Teresa, I'll be Gandhi. No, I don't mean that. But let's try to, live among the poorest of the poor. Let's visit the prisons regularly. Let's work with immigrants, migrants, the homeless.
Mm-hmm.
But right from early on, even when I was literally in the same room as Mother Teresa back in 1973 at the Home for the Dying. That day, I happened to be I was there just volunteering for a few days, and I was assigned to mop the floor. So I was mopping the floor, and she came in with some very distinguished-looking visitors. But I wasn't about to drop my mop and run over and say, "Hi, Mother Teresa, you're doing a great job." So
Mm.
I just watched her from across the room. But as she told, she worked with Jesuits in Calcutta, and she had Jesuit spiritual directors for herself and the nuns. She said, "Now listen, Father, what I want you to remember is you are not Mother Teresa. You are not called to do the work I do. You have St. Xavier's on Park Street. You have the great academic work. You have the great scholars. That's what God wants of you. And it wasn't 100%, that only, because there are Jesuits who work among the very poorest of the
Yeah.
poor. But in sense of even Mother Teresa saying, there are other ways to do God's will and to serve the people of God. And so I found that when it came to after Kathmandu, after theology study, after ordination, once I got to the University of Chicago, this is either you give yourself to it and you do it at a highly demanding level because they expected academic excellence and your best work, or do something else. And so when I went to in the 80s and again in the 90s and lived for several years in Tamil Nadu, in Madras, Chennai, I was not living in luxury. I was not living in a comfy place and no five-star hotel or anything, rather simple Jesuit house. But I was also, going on my bicycle across town to a bookstore to spend 600 rupees on a new Sanskrit text I wanted, and driving back past slums and thinking I could have skipped the book and given the 600 rupees to the people here. And sometimes I did give away money that I had to give, but other times saying, if I want to do the work that I'm doing, I need the book. And the ability, like it or not, to make a choice like that is very hard. And that turned out to be my life. So, right, Jesuits, we have vow of poverty. Technically, I own nothing, even though I have a credit card, I have a nice office, I live in a decent house. All these things are there, but they could be taken away tomorrow. I could be asked to go somewhere else and none of it. I think in a way, one has to be, I mean, it's detachment, I suppose, as in the Gita, as in other texts of yoga and so on. Wherever you are, if you're the beggar on the street or the king in the palace, none of this, the benefits or the losses don't determine who you are or what you do with your life. And while I might have had a preference at one point, I want to be like Gandhi. I want to be like Dr. Martin Luther King. I want to be, the saint in the streets. Too bad. That's not what I was called to do.
Yeah.
And to do what I do, I need a nice office and I need books on the shelves that's behind me.
Yeah.
And so you make a choice and you realize another life could have been different and I could have done other things and I didn't do them.
Thank you. Yeah, I cannot avoid thinking about the Jungian term individuation, and that at the end of the day, Francis Clooney has to be Francis Clooney because you cannot be anyone else, and Swami Padmanabha has to be Swami Padmanabha. As simple as that sounds, it's as difficult as it is, because it's always the temptation of comparing yourself with someone else, and the grass seems greener on the other side of the fence. But how to navigate that tension of, okay, following your call, and you are not able to encompass so many other things, not only you will like to do, but so many needs and necessities that one can witness. And something that came to my mind, I'd like to share with you for a moment. Today I received, I'm subscribed to one newsletter from Henry Nouwen, which I'm sure you know him.
Sure.
And he will say that the title is very brief. It says, "Faithful to your call," in this connection. And he will say, if you live a life of watching and waiting, you will know what kind of call you have. You are not called to solve every problem in the world. Jesus was not called to go all over the world. He was called to be faithful to his own people. Every human being has a call. I work with mentally handicapped people. Sometimes I spend hours with one person and we barely speak. Does that help people in Bosnia? Does it help people in Northern Ireland? Does it help people in Somalia? I don't know, but I think it does. I think that when I'm faithful to one person who is given to me, when I'm convinced that's my vocation, then I am doing more than when I am anxiously trying to put out all the fires all over the world. And that gives me peace.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Yeah, that's very
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah. Somehow yes.
And somehow to live with a sense of conscience and awareness as we see the news and we read of the incredible sufferings of people far away and nearby. Not to shut that out and pretend the world is all very nice. But on the other hand, as he says so beautiful, don't live in anxiety. Don't live saying, I really should be doing something else. I shouldn't be here. I should be somewhere else. No, when you, as best you can at a certain point in your life, it could change later.
Mm.
What I'm doing is what God wants me to do, and I do it, and I believe it helps us, the
Yeah,
human race.
yeah, yeah. It's a form, yeah, not only acceptance for me, but a form of gratefulness to the gifts that are
Yeah,
knocking our doors in the form of God's call. Yeah.
yeah.
So, Frank, as a celibate Jesuit, you mentioned that. How do you navigate? I always like to ask that to fellow celibates. How do you navigate the lifelong call to a life of celibacy? Like I am as a Swami, as a sannyasi, to integrate emotion, solitude, uh, creativity, intimacy. I personally like to think about sex not merely as a biological act, but as sexual energy, as we will speak in our tradition, and that takes the form of creativity, intimacy, connection, and of course we celibate need to still transform and express, dovetail that energy in a way or another. So I'd love to hear your thoughts
Yeah.
in navigating that.
Thank you. I mean, this is obviously a big issue, and I think when people think about renunciance in your tradition, my tradition, monastics, there is obedience following the rules of the order. There's also poverty about not accumulating wealth and buying nice things and having a nice retirement home or any of these things, and celibacy, chastity. Um, and I think we have to be honest on a number of things. I mean, I do spend some pages in the book talking about the three vows because they're part of who I am from when I was 18, 19 years old until
Mm.
now. Is that there's nothing evil about sex between a
Mm-hmm.
couple. There's nothing about it that's depraved. It's not better. People who don't have sex are better than people who do have sex. God created the human race. God created people to love one another, to be in intimate relationship with one another. And this is a gift of God. And
Mm-hmm.
so, not to say I have a greater gift of God to not do any of that nasty stuff, but rather God has called me to something that is not for most people. As it says in the first book of the Bible, it is not good for man to be alone. And so God creates Eve to be with Adam.
Mm-hmm.
The disciples of Jesus, he calls them, they follow him. But at one point, he visits Peter's house, and Peter's mother-in-law is sick. And guess what? Nothing was said about Peter's wife. But if he has a mother-in-law, he probably has a wife. And in the sense that there's nothing evil about being a married person.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we do it then? And I think we have to be careful. We have to be prudent. And there are all kinds of temptations, you might say, in an oversexed culture or a culture where there's such emphasis on stimulus of all sort,
Mm-hmm.
to be careful, to not be foolhardy about, I can take all temptations and I'll be the great saint. No, you have to be careful with yourself. But you also have to admit that you're a person of desires, a person of physical needs, and try to balance your life, have a certain kind of sense of the limits of what choices you've made.
Mm-hmm.
It's both, the sexual relationships. It's also not having the family, not having the children, not having the grandchildren as you get older, but also saying, how do I be not a neurotic person whose life is defined by what they don't have, but be a person who's called to a certain kind of love that is who we are,
Mm-hmm.
and to realize it is possible. And despite the abuses that people in different traditions put to their monastic or priestly lives, and we know all about that, it's possible to find a joy in celibacy, a joy in the love of God, the love of neighbor of a different sort, where God gives us the strength to live out the vows God has called us to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we certainly, the Society of Jesus, we usually live in community.
Mm-hmm.
We live not alone, but we live with brothers in Christ, and we have community, younger, older, together. And that's very important, is to have, like normal people, friendships, have
Mm-hmm.
relationships, have some sense of obligation, but to realize that as you say, the kind of the sexual energy is turned within, and it permeates our bodies and souls within, and then is used in a different way. Um, all of this has happened for thousands of years, and I think we don't want to romanticize it and say, "Oh, this is so easy; everybody can do it." And it's not for most people, but to be able to say, the physicality of my love is still there, the emotionality of my love, the giving of my love, but it's in this spiritual realm that it works itself out. I don't know. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, and I'm sure many
Of
the
course.
listeners would be thinking about this, and not to trivialize the difficulties, but say, you can do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
If God calls you to it, you can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think Thomas Merton said that that's a divine call to live a life of monasticism. I'm not saying another type of life is not a call from God. And my point is, if we just try to make a superficial effort to increase the numbers, we'll just take to the ruin of the order, basically, instead of its natural flourishing. So yeah. So Francis, as we wrap up, a few more minutes, if you have with me. Again, as I mentioned, you kindly endorsed my book, my third book, Evolution in Divine Love, where I try to explain, among other topics, about the ever-evolving nature of love, and therefore how a God that generally is depicted as changeless on one level could be also conceived as growing constantly in the experience of love. And in that connection, I don't know, I relate to something I heard you mentioning, speaking about imagination. Recently, you say like something to the ability, imagination is the ability to envision a larger world that we presently inhabit. I recently also have been introduced to the work of Walter Brueggemann, and he speaks a lot about imagination. So I'm trying to put all these things together, because in one sense now I'm seeing this third book of mine as an exercise in imagination about, like, let's try to go beyond our normal notions of the divine as merely static, changeless, timeless, and something more dynamic, ever fresh, ever expanding. I don't know if you have anything that comes at this moment that you would like to share in that regard.
I suppose the first thing would be to recommend your book to people.
That was not the intention of my question. Just
no, but I do recommend it to people. It's a beautiful book. I think we have to be aware that there is a certain kind of, rationality and practicality to our lives, and a certain kind of logic, which helps keep us going and helps keep the traffic flowing on the highways and keeps economies going and so on. But there's also the profound sense of, the aesthetic and the experiential, which shows up in the arts, in music, in dance, in other aesthetic practices, poetry, song, that I think opens up the realm of the beautiful. And the realm of the beautiful is a realm of the imagination, where through personal intuitions or learning from the great artists and musicians and so on, we realize that there's another whole dimension to life, which is not simply moral, is not simply rational, but is this realm of beauty and the sense of all the possibilities in the natural world, in the human world, and then all the things that we can imagine out of our personal lives. I mean, the ability to take, the images, imagination images come from our five senses and the things we've experienced, things we've seen, heard, touched, smelled, tasted, and so on, like that. And then play with them, a kind of lila, where we play with them, we see them in a different way, and to realize that what we create and imagine in our artistic sensitivity, you might say, is also showing us aspects of God that we had no real imagination of before and no sense of before. It's not always literal, but somehow through the poetry, through the song, through the rituals and so on like that, we begin to open our minds beyond the limits of again, the logical, the rational, into much greater realms. And so we have to be able, individually, to imagine where we are in our lives and imagine the uncertainties of the future and the way it could work out. But the human race has to do this too. We all have to realize we're on this, difficult, vexed planet with environmental crises and war and poverty. We have to imagine where will the world be in 1,000 years? What is the plan that God has for us and that we can imagine? And then how do we get there? And that's not simply a logical process. That's sort of following intuitions and imagining the big picture beyond ourselves.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the notion of imagination as a discipline, even as a sadhana, and not necessarily as synonymous with fantasy, like you're just indulging in daydreaming, but actually going beyond our usual way of thinking or conceiving things and embracing more real patterns of reality. So thank you for that. So Frank, as we conclude, I always mention in our, at least Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, though in Hindu tradition in general, sometimes they have this saying, Madhurena samapayet, like at the end, let's end with something sweet, sometimes whether in terms of eating or speaking. Somehow in some of my podcasts, I finish with something called Ushnena samapayet, or let's ending with something somehow spicy, in the sense of, I would like to ask you a few questions, all of them very short, and I invite you to reply in an equally very short way, just a few words. Okay. Spicy in that sense, nothing too controversial, just
Okay.
So I like to present you a few questions. With that, we are wrapping up. So the first one, you're already there. You have fastened your seatbelt, I can see.
Yes.
So, which is the main similarity between Hinduism and Catholicism, in your opinion?
A sacramental reality where the things of the body and the mind and the spiritual world all go together.
Beautiful. And which is the main difference between Hinduism and Catholicism?
Probably, oh God, that's a hard one.
I say it was spicy a little bit.
The difference might be between Catholic and Hindu is very enormous centrality to the Catholic Church, the hierarchy up to the Pope, and a sense that we're all part of a community that has certain rules and laws. Whereas with the Hindu traditions, there are many local leaders, local teachers, but there's no kind of unifying, there's no Pope.
Yeah.
And that may be a difference that sounds, institutional, but it may affect many other things as well, how we find our way within our communities.
Which is the main similarity between being a priest and being a scholar?
Focus, giving yourself to something and trying to make a life of it, a love of words and use of words, being a teacher. Certainly the priest has to preach. The priest has to say things that inspire people to live better lives. And the professor has to write in a way that does some good for somebody. And the professor is in the classroom and with young people all the time. So how do we dedicate ourselves in a way that our words matter to those who listen to us?
And now, which is the main difference between priesthood and scholarship?
Being a priest for me in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Catholic parish, is a sense of this is a community that's already devoted to Christ. This is a community that wants to go deeper in that relationship. And we are here this morning in the church for the Mass because we have that sense. Everybody's welcome, but nonetheless, we're here as disciples of Christ. The professor in the classroom, and particularly a place like Harvard University where I am, there can be no presupposition or assumption that everybody is a lover of God or a Christian or sharing the values. In the church, I may try to persuade people to see the world in a certain way. But in the classroom, I'm trying to allow my students and prompt them to think for themselves. And that they're not unrelated, but that's a different dynamic.
Yeah. Thank you. Next one. What do you most appreciate in Ramanuja's theology?
There are many beautiful things in Ramanuja's theology. His version of the interpretation of the Gita, his Brahma Sutra commentary. What often people ignore that I love are the Gadya Traya, the three devotional works, the Sharanagati Gadyam, and so on like that. And the sense of all of this intellectual work, the commentaries, the distinctions, the arguments with Advaita, and so on like that, are all about becoming the kind of person who can give yourself completely to God. And I think there's a way in which the entirety of his system points to 1866 of the Gita.
Yeah,
Come to me,
Sarvadharman Parityaja.
and he's creating an intellectual world in which that Charma Shloka makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what do you most appreciate in Gaudiya Vaishnavism?
Which I know much less about.
Mm-hmm.
My friends, first of all, point me to the beauties of the Bhagavata Purana, Book 10 in particular,
Mm-hmm.
the Leelas of Krishna. That's incredibly beautiful and incredibly deep in meaning.
Mm.
And so I go back there. And then text I've run into over the years. A little bit I've read only of Rupa Goswami, Jiva Goswami, but can see the brilliance of these intellectuals who are rooted in the Vaishnava tradition, the Gita, the Bhagavatam, and so on like that.
Mm.
And I suppose even contemporary ways in which people, let's say in ISKCON, the Hare Krishna tradition, live out in a modern America this kind of sense of living, loving God, and showing kind of by a living bhakti that the ancient traditions still matter. All that shows me Gaudiya Vaishnavism is a very deep and ancient and also living tradition.
Mm. Thank you. And what do you most appreciate about being a Jesuit?
Being a Jesuit is a great gift. It's not meant for everyone. Even among religious, there are Trappists, there are Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, and others. I think what our founder Ignatius Loyola wanted was in a post-monastic world, when we're no longer living in monasteries on the hilltops, rather to be taking this commitment to Christ, being disciples of Christ, the society of Jesus, his companions, and then taking it out into the streets, being out in the streets, being with the people, being in politics, being in the sciences, being professors at universities like Harvard. There's a great sense of both dedication. We try to have the same kind of dedication and discipline as a Trappist monk, but we also say, I'm not going to be in the monastery 95% of the time. I'm going to be out on the street. As we say, finding God in all things. Sort of is one way of capturing it. Wherever we go, God is already there. Whatever we do, God is there. There is no secular realm that is somehow off limits to us. We go there because God is there. And I think that's a gift that I see as essential to Jesuit life.
Thank you. 3 more questions and we are done, Frank.
Okay.
Who is one Hindu theologian or mystic that you wish more Christians knew about?
I would say in the Tamil Vaishnava tradition, the one who's called Namalvar.
Okay.
So Namalvar, Shatakopan, beautiful Tamil poetry, thousands of 1,500 verses of beautiful poetry, some of the most beautiful poetry in the world, and the heartfelt devotion that you catch devotion yourself if you read Namalvar.
And who is one Christian mystic you think speaks well to Hindu readers?
There are many, I think.
Yeah, sorry to be reductionistic in some of these questions, asking just for one.
One that I would say that probably most people have not heard of is Gertrude of Helfta. Gertrude of Helfta was a medieval nun who wrote both confessional work about her experiences of God and intimacy with Christ, and another book called The Spiritual Exercises, about how we in community can live the life. And I go back to her work as very Jesus-centered, very personal, and very much a sense of the community. So Gertrude of Helfta would be the one I'd recommend.
Thank you. So last question, if your next book were a coda to this love story, to this memoir you just published, what themes will it need to wrestle with? Either unresolved tensions or new frontiers?
Well, for me, the new frontier, as I mentioned before, in August, I turned 75. And I'm in presumably the final quarter of life, therefore, however long it may be. And I talk about this in the last chapter of the book. What then? So you write the memoir, you're finished in a sense telling the story of how you got to be where you are, given God's grace and given good health and so on. Now what? And what is it that at 75 or 80 or 85 I can do? So the vistas are limited. There are innumerable things I can't do at my age. But in terms of how to use each day of my life, how to continue to do my work, but not as a young man, but as an older person who has certain, hopefully, wisdom of life, to say, in the remaining years of life, as death approaches, how do I both admit death and live to the full? That's the challenge now.
Thank you. And for me, those are the words of someone who is voluntarily entering that chapter as an elder. And we need so badly, we need elders in this world and society. So, dear Frank, thank you so much for being one of those elders for many of us. And thank you so much for joining our conversation today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.